In the great hall of Turnberry Castle, as autumn winds swept in from the Irish Sea, carrying the salt and promise of distant lands, a child was born who would one day unite a nation through blood, betrayal, and an unbreakable will. Robert Bruce entered the world on July 11th, 1274, heir to a legacy of ambition that stretched back through generations of nobles who had learned to survive by never fully committing to any cause save their own advancement. The Scotland of Robert's birth was a kingdom balanced on the edge of catastrophe, though few could see it then. Alexander III ruled from Edinburgh to the Hebrides, a king who had brought peace and prosperity after decades of turmoil. The markets bustled with merchants from Flanders and France. Scottish ships sailed to the Baltic for timber and to the Mediterranean for wine, and the great abbeys rose like prayers in stone across the landscape. It was a golden age. But golden ages, like autumn leaves, are beautiful precisely because they are about to fall. Young Robert's world was one of calculated complexity. His father, Robert Bruce the Elder, held lands in both Scotland and England, a strategic hedging of bets that was typical of the Anglo-Norman nobility who had settled in Scotland generations before. His mother, Marjorie, Countess of Carrick in her own right, brought Celtic blood and vast estates in southwest Scotland. From birth, Robert was raised to think not as a Scot or an Englishman, but as a Bruce, which meant thinking like someone who might one day be king. The Bruce claim to the Scottish throne was not fantasy, but legal argument. When the direct royal line had failed before, Robert's grandfather, also named Robert Bruce, called the competitor, had been one of the strongest claimants. The family never forgot that they had come within a legal judgment of wearing the crown. Every young Robert learned was preparation for the possibility that one day, through politics or providence, a Bruce would sit on the stone of destiny. Picture the boy Robert in Turnberry's Solar, where sunlight streaming through precious glass windows illuminated his lessons. His tutors were carefully chosen: a French knight to teach him warfare and chivalry, a priest to ground him in Latin and theology, a Celtic bard to ensure he could speak to Highlanders in their own tongue. He learned to read Caesar's commentaries in the original Latin, understanding how great commanders thought. He studied the history of Scotland's kings, from the legendary Kenneth MacAlpin to the current Alexander, learning how power was gained, held, and lost. But Robert's most important education came from watching his grandfather and father navigate the treacherous currents of Scottish politics. The kingdom was divided between competing factions: the Commons, the Balliols, the Bruces, each with their own claim to influence and their own vision for Scotland's future. Young Robert learned that in this world, today's ally was tomorrow's enemy, and the only constant was change. When Robert was 12, his ordered world shattered. On a dark March night in 1286, Alexander III rode through a storm to reach his young queen at Kinghorn. His horse stumbled on the cliff path, and Scotland's king lay broken on the rocks below, the golden age ending with his final breath. The heir was Alexander's granddaughter, Margaret, a 3-year-old girl far away in Norway. Scotland held its breath, waiting to see if a child could hold a kingdom together. The Bruces saw opportunity in crisis. As one of the primary claimants to the throne, should young Margaret die, they began building alliances, securing their position. Robert's grandfather emerged from retirement, that old warrior displaying an energy that belied his years. The boy Robert watched as his family played the great game of thrones, learning lessons no tutor could teach. When Margaret died in Orkney in 1290, never having set foot on Scottish soil, the kingdom faced a succession crisis that threatened civil war. 13 claimants came forward, but only 2 truly mattered: John Balliol and Robert Bruce the Competitor. Both descended from daughters of a David, Earl of Huntingdon, but through different lines. The legal arguments were complex, but the political reality was simple. Whoever won would need military might to make their claim stick. Rather than fight a civil war that would destroy the kingdom, the Scottish nobles made a fateful decision. They invited Edward I of England, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, to arbitrate the succession. It seemed logical. Edward was respected, feared, and supposedly neutral. The Scots would learn too late that inviting a wolf to choose between sheep was never neutral. Edward arrived at the Scottish border with an army, making clear that his arbitration came with conditions. All claimants must acknowledge him as overlord of Scotland. The Scottish nobles, desperate to avoid civil war, agreed to this temporary arrangement, believing that once a king was chosen, Scottish independence would reassert itself. Young Robert, now 16, watched his grandfather swallow his pride and swear fealty to Edward for the chance at a crown. The court Edward convened at Berwick in 1291 was grand theatre with a predetermined outcome. Edward had already decided that John Balliol, descended from the senior line, would be king. But more importantly, Balliol would be a king who owed his throne to England, a vassal rather than an independent monarch. When the decision was announced in November 1292, Robert Bruce the Competitor's dreams of kingship died, and with them something in the old man's spirit broke. Young Robert learned perhaps his most important lesson that day. Legal right meant nothing without the power to enforce it. His grandfather had the better claim in many eyes, but Balliol had Edward's support. The Bruces withdrew to their estates, biding their time, neither accepting Balliol's kingship nor openly rebelling against it. It was a position that would define Robert's early life. Always calculating, always waiting, never fully committed. King John Balliol's reign was doomed from the start. Edward treated him not as a fellow king, but as a subordinate, summoning him to English courts, overruling Scottish law, demanding Scottish soldiers for English wars. The Scottish nobles who had accepted temporary overlordship watched in horror as it became permanent subjugation. They called their king Tum Tabard, empty coat, mocking his powerlessness. By 1295, even Balliol had enough. Scotland formed an alliance with France, Edward's great enemy. It was a declaration of independence, but it came too late and with too little preparation. Edward's response was swift and terrible. In 1296, he invaded Scotland with an army that was less military force than engine of destruction. The Sack of Berwick showed Scotland what resistance would cost. Edward's army slaughtered the inhabitants, men, women, children, until the streets ran red and the harbour was choked with bodies. It was deliberate terror, a message written in blood that defiance meant death. Young Robert, now 22 and his own man after his father's submission to Edward, watched and learned another lesson. Mercy was weakness in the game of kingdoms. The Battle of Dunbar followed, where Scottish resistance was shattered in a single afternoon. Balliol was stripped of his kingship in a ceremony designed to humiliate, his royal insignia torn from him, his throne removed to England. The stone of destiny, on which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, was carried south as a trophy. Scotland ceased to be a kingdom and became merely northern England. It was in this atmosphere of defeat and occupation that young Robert Bruce made his first major decision. Unlike his father, who submitted completely to Edward, Robert joined the resistance. But characteristically, he did so carefully, maintaining plausible deniability, keeping routes of retreat open. When William Wallace rose in 1297, Robert initially supported him, seeing opportunity in chaos. But Robert was not Wallace. Where Wallace burned with righteous fury, Robert calculated odds. Where Wallace saw black and white, Robert saw infinite shades of grey. At Irvine in 1297, when faced with superior English forces, Robert negotiated terms rather than fight a losing battle. Wallace called it cowardice. Robert called it wisdom. The young nobleman spent the years of Wallace's rising and fall playing all sides. He served as guardian of Scotland with John Comyn after Wallace's defeat at Falkirk. But their guardianship was marked more by their rivalry than resistance to England. He submitted to Edward when convenient, rebelled when profitable, always keeping his ultimate goal in sight. Not Scottish freedom in abstract, but Bruce kingship in reality. By 1304, Robert had submitted to Edward again, serving in the English administration of Scotland. To patriots, he was a collaborator. To Edward, he was a useful noble who understood reality. To himself, he was a man waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to claim what his grandfather had been denied. That moment came in the most unexpected way. In February 1306, Robert met with John Comyn, his great rival, in Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. What they discussed remains history's mystery. Perhaps joint rebellion, perhaps mutual betrayal. What is certain is that the meeting ended with Robert's dagger in Comyn's body, blood spreading across the church floor, sacrilege that would echo through eternity. Whether the murder was planned or passionate, calculated or spontaneous, it changed everything. Robert had burned every bridge, closed every retreat. He could no longer play multiple sides, because all sides would now unite against him, a murderer and sacrilegious one at that. He had, through violence, simplified his options to two: claim the crown or die trying. 6 weeks later, on Palm Sunday, 1306, Robert Bruce was hastily crowned King of Scots at Scone. The ceremony was makeshift. The true crown jewels were in English hands. Many nobles were absent. The Bishop of St. Andrews was imprisoned. But Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, whose family held the hereditary right to crown Scottish kings, defied her English husband to place a simple gold circlet on Robert's head. The man who rose from that coronation was no longer young Robert, learning to navigate between kingdoms. He was Robert I, King of Scots, committed irrevocably to a cause that seemed hopeless. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was coming with the largest army he had ever assembled. Most of Scotland's nobles opposed the murderer of Comyn. The Church would excommunicate him for sacrilege. But Robert had one advantage his enemies overlooked. He had spent 32 years learning from everyone, from his grandfather's ambition, his father's caution, Wallace's passion, Edward's ruthlessness. He understood that Scotland could not be freed through one glorious battle or one heroic gesture. It would take years of patient struggle, countless defeats before victory, sacrifices that would test the very soul of the nation. As he stood in Scone Abbey, newly crowned, Robert must have thought of the journey that had brought him here. Born between kingdoms, raised between loyalties, he had finally chosen his path. The calculator had become a king. The pragmatist had become a patriot. And though he didn't know it yet, the murderer in Greyfriars Church would become the greatest king Scotland would ever know. The boy who had learned to survive by never fully committing was now committed beyond redemption. There could be no more hedging, no more calculating, no more waiting for perfect moments. From this day forward, Robert Bruce would either free Scotland or die in the attempt. The education was over. The real test was about to begin. The summer sun that had shone on Robert Bruce's coronation turned to bitter autumn rain as disaster followed disaster in the months after he claimed the crown. By October 1306, the King of Scots was reduced to a handful of followers, hiding in the heather of the Western Highlands, listening for the baying of English hounds that tracked them like animals. The transformation from crowned king to hunted fugitive had taken less than 6 months. The unravelling began at Methven, near Perth, on a June night when the air hung heavy with the promise of storm. Bruce had gathered an army of perhaps 4,500 men, Highland clansmen, lowland farmers, minor nobles who saw opportunity in revolution. They were poorly equipped, but fierce, men who believed that Bannockburn's spirit might rise again under their new king. Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke and Edward I's lieutenant in Scotland, commanded the English response. He was everything Bruce had once been: calculating, careful, willing to use any means to achieve his ends. When he sent a formal challenge to Bruce for battle the next day, the new king accepted, believing even English lords must honour chivalric conventions. But chivalry died that night at Methven. As Bruce's army slept, secure in the belief that battle would come with dawn, Valence attacked. The English came like thunder in the darkness, cavalry crashing through the Scottish camp before sentries could raise alarm. Men died in their sleep, struck down before they could reach for weapons. Others fled naked into the night, their king's army becoming a terrified mob in minutes. Bruce himself barely escaped, fighting his way to his horse in his nightshirt, his sword arm already bloody from desperate defence. Around him, his nascent kingdom collapsed. His brother-in-law, Christopher Seaton, was captured, trying to rally the scattered forces. The Earl of Athol, one of the few great nobles who had supported Bruce's coronation, was taken along with hundreds of others. Dawn revealed the scale of catastrophe. Of 4,500 men who had slept confident in their cause, fewer than 500 remained with Bruce. The others were dead, captured, or fled. Worse, the defeat shattered the illusion of Bruce's kingship. What manner of king fled in his nightclothes? What loyalty did a leader deserve who couldn't protect his followers? Bruce retreated westward into Argyll, hoping to find shelter among the MacDougals. but this clan was bound by blood to the Commons. John Comyn, whom Bruce had murdered, was their kinsman. At Dalry, in a narrow pass between steep mountains, the MacDougals struck. This was not the formal warfare of knights and chivalry, but the savage clan fighting of the Highlands. Men who knew every rock and tree of their territory against exhausted fugitives struggling through unknown terrain. The MacDougals came screaming from the heights, claymores flashing, arrows finding gaps in armor. Bruce fought with the fury of desperation. 3 MacDougall warriors grabbed him, trying to drag him from his horse. He killed one with his sword, another with his dagger, but the third held tight to his cloak. Bruce unfastened the brooch holding it and spurred away, leaving the man with a handful of cloth while the king kept his life. That brooch would become a MacDougall trophy, proof of how close they had come to ending Bruce's rebellion. By the time Bruce escaped Dalry, his force numbered fewer than 200. His kingdom had shrunk to the ground he stood on, his authority to the reach of his sword. Winter was coming, and with it the certainty that Edward's vengeance would be terrible. Bruce made the hardest decision of his life. He sent his wife Elizabeth de Burgh, his daughter Marjorie, his sisters Mary and Christian, north to Turnberry Castle under the protection of his youngest brother Nigel. He hoped stone walls and his brother's courage might protect them while he disappeared into the wilderness. With his remaining brothers, Edward, Thomas, and Alexander, and perhaps 40 loyal men, Bruce took to the sea. Some chronicles say he sailed to Rathlin Island, that rocky outpost between Scotland and Ireland. Others claim he found shelter in the Western Isles under the protection of Angus Og MacDonald. Still others suggest he spent months in Ireland itself, where the Bruce family had connections. Wherever Bruce spent that terrible winter of 1306 to 1307, it was there that legend claims he watched a spider in a cave, trying repeatedly to attach its web to a beam, failing 6 times before succeeding on the 7th. If at first you don't succeed, try again, the spider supposedly taught the fugitive king. The story may be myth, but it captures truth. Bruce's extraordinary ability to endure failure without accepting defeat. While Bruce contemplated spiders and survival, Edward's vengeance fell upon those left behind. Turnberry Castle was betrayed by its blacksmith, who set fire to the grain stores. As flames consumed the castle's food supplies, the garrison had no choice but surrender. Nigel Bruce, barely 20 years old, was dragged to Berwick and subjected to the same horrific execution as William Wallace, hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body parts displayed as warning. The women's fate was cruel in a different way. Bruce's wife, Elizabeth, daughter of the powerful Earl of Ulster, was placed under house arrest, her father's influence saving her from worse. But Bruce's sister Mary was imprisoned in a cage at Roxburgh Castle, a wooden and iron structure built into the castle walls, open to weather and public view. Isabella Macduff, who had crowned Bruce, suffered the same fate at Berwick. For 4 years, these women would be displayed like animals, testament to Edward's cruelty. Bruce's daughter, Marjorie, only 12, was confined to a nunnery, a prisoner in all but name. His brothers Thomas and Alexander, captured trying to raise forces in Galloway, were executed at Carlisle. Christopher Seaton, taken at Methven, was hanged at Dumfries. The Earl of Athol claimed noble privilege and was hanged on a gallows 30 feet high, a grotesque honour for his rank. As 1306 ended, Robert Bruce had lost everything except his life. His family was dead or imprisoned, his supporters scattered or executed, his kingdom a mockery. Edward I, despite his 67 years and failing health, had crushed another Scottish rebellion. The English king ordered that Bruce, when captured, should suffer a death that would make Wallace's execution seem merciful. Yet something had changed in Bruce during those months of catastrophe. The calculating politician who had switched sides whenever convenient was gone, burned away by loss and suffering. What remained was harder, purer, more dangerous. A man who had passed through the crucible of absolute defeat and emerged with absolute determination. In February 1307, Bruce returned to the Scottish mainland, landing in his own earldom of Carrick with those same 40 men who had stayed loyal through everything. It was insanity. Carrick was occupied by English forces, his own castle of Turnberry held by Henry Percy with a strong garrison. Any rational calculation said he was sailing to his death. But Bruce was done with rational calculation. He sent message ahead to his former tenants, calling on ancient loyalties. The response was weak. Perhaps 300 men joined him, mostly the desperate and dispossessed. The nobility stayed away, considering his cause hopeless. The church had excommunicated him. Even many who hated English rule saw Bruce as a murderer whose sins had brought catastrophe on all who followed him. The English prepared to crush this last pathetic gesture. Percy had professional soldiers, strong walls, ample supplies. Bruce had peasants with improvised weapons hiding in the hills. But Bruce had learned from his disasters. No more pitched battles. No more trusting in chivalric conventions. This would be a different kind of war. He used his intimate knowledge of Carrick's terrain, its hidden valleys and secret paths. His men struck English patrols at dawn and dusk, killed sentries in the night, burned supply wagons, and vanished like smoke. They made Percy afraid to leave Turnberry Castle while making the castle a prison rather than a stronghold. Slowly, painfully, Bruce's force grew. Not through noble recruitment, but through common folk who had nothing left to lose. James Douglas, the young lord whose lands had been confiscated, joined with a handful of followers, beginning a friendship that would become legendary. Thomas Randolph, Bruce's nephew, was captured from English service and gradually won back to the Scottish cause. The death of Edward I in July 1307 changed everything. The hammer of the Scots died at Berg by Sands, within sight of Scotland, his last command that his bones should be carried before English armies until Scotland was conquered. But his son Edward II was not his father. Where Edward I was iron, Edward II was silk. The new king withdrew most English forces, having no stomach for grinding guerrilla war in Scottish bogs. As word spread that Longshanks was dead, that his weak son had abandoned the fight, something stirred in Scottish hearts. Bruce was still alive, still fighting, still claiming his crown. Men who had thought his cause hopeless began to reconsider. The spider had attached its web on the 7th try. By year's end, Bruce commanded nearly 1,000 men. Not much against England's might, but infinitely more than the 40 who had landed at Carrick. More importantly, he had learned the crucial lessons that would eventually bring victory. Trust no one completely. Strike from shadows rather than daylight. Make the enemy afraid in their own strongholds. Turn weakness into strength by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. The year of running had nearly destroyed Robert Bruce, but what emerged from that crucible was no longer a man playing at kingship. He had paid for his crown with everything he held dear: family, comfort, safety, even his soul according to the church. Having paid so much, he would never surrender what he had purchased with such pain. The transformation was complete. The nobleman who had betrayed Wallace's memory now carried on Wallace's work, but with a patience Wallace never possessed. The politician who had calculated odds now fought against impossible odds. The man who had kept all options open now had only one option: victory or death. As 1308 dawned, Bruce stood not as the crowned king of a united Scotland, but as a guerrilla chief of a desperate band. Yet in that desperation lay the seed of eventual triumph. He had learned that kingdoms were not won in a day, but in 1,000 days of patient struggle. The year of running was over. The years of fighting back were about to begin. The spring of 1308 found Robert Bruce standing over the battlefield at Brander Pass, watching the MacDougall dead being stripped of their weapons by his men, and for the first time since his coronation, he allowed himself to believe that he might actually survive to be more than a footnote in history. The victory here, following his success at Loudoun Hill the year before, marked the moment when Bruce transformed from fugitive to conqueror, from pretender to true king. The campaign that led to Brander had been methodical, displaying a new Bruce, patient where he had been impulsive, strategic where he had been reactive. Through the winter months, he had built his strength in Carrick and Ayrshire, no longer just raiding, but systematically taking control. English garrisons found themselves isolated, cut off from supplies and reinforcement, forced to surrender or starve. At Loudoun Hill in May 1307, Bruce had shown he had learned from both Wallace's victories and defeats. When Aymer de Valence approached with 3,000 men to Bruce's 600, the Scottish king chose his ground carefully, a narrow field bounded by marshes where English cavalry advantage was nullified. He had his men dig trenches, creating channels that would funnel the English into kill zones. The battle was brief, but decisive. The English cavalry, channeled by Bruce's earthworks, could only attack in narrow columns where Scottish spears could reach them. Valence, the man who had surprised Bruce at Methven, now found himself surprised by Bruce's tactical sophistication. The English retreated, leaving Bruce master of the field, his first pitched battle victory as king. But Bruce understood that winning battles was easier than winning wars. Scotland remained divided, with many nobles still supporting the English or sitting neutral, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The Comyn faction, led by the Earl of Buchan, controlled much of the northeast and remained violently opposed to the man who had murdered their kinsman. Bruce decided on a strategy that would define his reign. He would be merciful to those who submitted, but merciless to those who resisted. When the Earl of Ross came to terms, Bruce confirmed his lands and titles. But when Buchan continued resistance, Bruce unleashed what became known as the Hership, or harrying of Buchan. For 50 miles in every direction from Buchan's strongholds, Bruce's men destroyed everything. Not just military targets, but the very ability of the land to support resistance. Castles were torn down stone by stone, manor houses burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered or driven off. It was calculated brutality, designed to show that opposing Bruce meant not just military defeat, but economic annihilation. The harrying of Buchan shocked even medieval Scotland, accustomed to warfare's cruelties. But it worked. Other nobles who had thought to resist reconsidered. If Bruce could destroy the mighty earldom of Buchan, what safety did anyone have? Submission began to seem the wiser course. Yet Bruce balanced terror with magnanimity. When Aberdeen, Scotland's great northern port, fell to his forces in the summer of 1308, there was no massacre, no general sack. Citizens who swore allegiance were protected. Trade was encouraged to resume. Bruce showed he could be not just a successful warlord, but a king who could govern. The Parliament Bruce summoned at St. Andrews in March 1309 was his first real attempt to legitimize his kingship beyond force of arms. Here, in Scotland's ecclesiastical capital, he gained recognition from the Scottish Church despite his excommunication. The declaration of the clergy argued that Bruce's killing of Comyn, while regrettable, had been justified by Comyn's treachery, and that Bruce was the rightful king by both blood and acclamation. This was revolutionary, the idea that the Church could judge a king's actions, that legitimacy came from the community of the realm rather than divine right alone. It wouldn't be fully developed for centuries, but the seeds of limited monarchy were planted in that gathering. Bruce also showed remarkable diplomatic skill. He negotiated truces with former enemies, understanding that Scotland needed unity more than he needed vengeance. When John of Lorne, the MacDougall chief who had nearly killed him at Dalry, was captured after Brander Pass, Bruce allowed him exile rather than execution. It was practical mercy. Dead enemies created blood feuds, but defeated enemies could become future allies. The campaign to control Scotland accelerated through 1309 and 1310. One by one, the great castles fell, not through traditional siege, but through Bruce's combination of subterfuge, intimidation, and his radical policy of destruction. When a castle fell, Bruce didn't garrison it, he destroyed it. Without castles, English administration couldn't function. Without strongholds to retreat to, English garrisons couldn't maintain control. Perth fell to a night assault in January 1313, Bruce himself wading through the freezing moat to place the first ladder against the walls. Dumfries was taken by Roger Kirkpatrick, the man who had ensured Comyn was dead. Caerlaverock, that mighty fortress that had defied Edward I, surrendered after its garrison realized no relief was coming. But it was the campaign for the border castles that showed Bruce at his most brilliant. These fortresses, Roxburgh, Edinburgh, Stirling, were the keys to Scotland. While they remained in English hands, Scotland could never be truly free. But they were too strong for conventional assault, and Bruce lacked siege engines. Instead, Bruce unleashed his captains, James Douglas, Thomas Randolph, Edward Bruce, giving them freedom to take these castles by any means necessary. what followed became the stuff of legend. Douglas took Roxburgh Castle on Shrove, Tuesday night, 1314, when the garrison was drunk on pre-Lenten celebration. His men wore black cloaks and crawled on all fours, appearing to sentries like cattle in the darkness. By the time the garrison realized the danger, Scots were inside the walls. Randolph took Edinburgh Castle by an even more audacious route, scaling the castle rock's north face, considered impossible to climb. A local man, William Francis, who had climbed it as a youth to visit a sweetheart, guided 30 picked men up the cliff face in darkness. They opened the gates to Randolph's main force, and Edinburgh fell in hours. Edward Bruce besieged Stirling, the last great English stronghold, and made an agreement with its commander that would have momentous consequences. If the castle wasn't relieved by midsummer 1314, it would surrender. This chivalric agreement forced Edward II to march north with the greatest English army since his father's day, leading directly to Bannockburn. Throughout these campaigns, Bruce was transforming not just Scotland's military situation, but its entire concept of warfare. He promoted based on merit rather than birth. James Douglas, once landless, became his greatest commander. Common soldiers who showed exceptional courage were knighted on the battlefield. He also revolutionized Scottish tactics. The schiltron, Wallace's defensive hedgehog of spears, became under Bruce a mobile offensive formation. Scottish armies learned to move fast, strike hard, and disappear before enemy response. They turned Scotland's poverty into advantage. Requiring less supplies, they could move faster than wealthy English armies burdened with baggage trains. The transformation of Scotland between 1308 and 1314 was remarkable. From a conquered province with English garrisons in every major town, it became a resurgent kingdom with only Stirling and Berwick still in English hands. From a divided nobility suspicious of Bruce's legitimacy, it developed a new unity forged by success and fear of Bruce's retribution. Bruce himself transformed from the desperate fugitive of 1307 to a king whose authority was unquestioned in most of Scotland. He held parliaments, issued charters, dispensed justice. He sent ambassadors to European courts, seeking recognition and alliance. He built a treasury through confiscated English property and renewed trade. Perhaps most importantly, he gave Scots something they hadn't had since Alexander III's death: belief in themselves. Not just hope, which Wallace had provided briefly, but genuine confidence that they could defeat England, could maintain independence, could stand as a nation among nations. The story that best captures this transformation involves Bruce's treatment of the Comyn family's matriarch. The elderly mother of the John Comyn, whom Bruce had murdered, came to court, expecting death or exile. Instead, Bruce received her with courtesy, granted her a pension, ensured her comfort. When asked why, he said simply, "We have harrowed enough. Now we must heal." This was the Bruce of 1314, still capable of ruthlessness when necessary, but understanding that lasting victory required reconciliation. He had learned from Edward I that fear alone created only temporary submission. He had learned from Wallace that passion alone led to glorious defeat. He combined both with something uniquely his own: the patient construction of a kingdom, that could endure. As midsummer 1314 approached, as Edward II's mighty army marched north to relieve Stirling, Bruce had transformed from the murderer of Dumfries to the architect of Scottish resurgence. He had turned the tide not through one great victory, but through hundreds of small ones, each building on the last. The Bruce who prepared to face Edward II at Bannockburn was no longer the desperate claimant who had seized the crown in 1306. He was a proven commander, a successful king, a leader who had shown that Scotland could not just resist, but triumph. The tide had turned, and now it remained to be seen whether it would carry Scotland to complete freedom or dash it once more against the rocks of English power. Dawn broke grey and misty over the Bannockburn on June 23, 1314, the sun struggling through clouds as if reluctant to illuminate what would become the most decisive day in Scottish history. Robert Bruce stood on the slope above the burn, watching 20,000 English soldiers advance, their armour catching what light filtered through, their banners creating a moving forest of silk and steel that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Bruce had chosen this ground with meticulous care over the previous weeks, riding over every yard, testing the firmness of the soil, noting where the burns created natural barriers, where the trees provided cover. The field at Bannockburn was his masterpiece of tactical preparation, a trap disguised as a battlefield where every English advantage would become a weakness. The Scottish army Bruce commanded was perhaps 7,000 strong, outnumbered 3-1. But these were not the frightened levies who had died at Falkirk. 8 years of successful warfare had forged them into veterans. They stood in 4 schiltrons, those bristling hedgehogs of 12-foot pikes that Bruce had transformed from static defensive formations into mobile offensive weapons. Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, commanded the vanguard with the steady competence that had taken Edinburgh Castle. Edward Bruce led the 2nd Division with the fierce aggression that had besieged Stirling. Young Walter Stewart and James Douglas jointly commanded the 3rd. The old nobility and the new combined. Bruce himself retained command of the 4th Division as reserve, along with 500 light cavalry under Robert Keith, ready to exploit any opportunity. The English host approaching them was everything medieval military might could muster. Edward II, desperate to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, had emptied England's arsenals and treasuries. The cavalry alone, 2,000 heavy horse, would have been an army in itself. Behind them marched 15,000 infantry, including 5,000 Welsh archers, whose arrows had turned Scottish victories into defeats before. But the English came with more than military might. They came with arrogance. Many nobles had already mentally divided Scottish estates they would receive as victory spoils. They had beaten Scots so many times before. Their king's father had crushed Wallace. What chance did this murderer king have against the assembled might of England? The first day's fighting began with single combat that would echo through centuries. Henry de Bohun, nephew of the Earl of Hereford, spotted Bruce reviewing his lines. The Scottish king was mounted on a small grey palfrey, not his war horse, wearing a gold circlet that marked his royal status. De Bohun saw glory, the chance to end the war with one charge. Bruce watched the English knight thundering toward him, lance levelled, destiny approaching at full gallop. His men cried warnings, but Bruce sat calm as stone until the last instant. Then, as de Bohun's lance reached for his heart, Bruce rose in his stirrups, shifted his weight, and his nimble horse sidestepped. In the same motion, Bruce brought his battle-axe down, with such force it split both helmet and skull, the axe handle shattering from the impact. De Bohun crashed to the ground, dead before the dust settled. The Scots roared approval, while the English stood stunned. Bruce rode back to his lines, his only complaint being the loss of his favourite axe. But the psychological victory was complete. Their king had faced England's best without flinching. Later that afternoon, English cavalry tried to flank the Scottish position, seeking to relieve Stirling Castle and attack Bruce from behind. But they encountered Randolph's schiltron, positioned precisely to prevent such manoeuvre. The English charged repeatedly, but horses would not impale themselves on the hedge of spears. They circled the formation like wolves around a fire, unable to break in, losing men with every attempt. As darkness fell, the English had achieved nothing except casualties and frustration. They made camp on what seemed the only ground large enough for their army. The cars between the burns, a seemingly solid meadow that would prove their doom. They were confident tomorrow would bring victory, unaware they had placed themselves exactly where Bruce wanted them. The price Bruce paid for Scotland's crown was everything. Family, health, soul, perhaps. He had started as calculating nobleman, switching sides for advantage, and ended as dying king who had sacrificed all for vision of free Scotland. The transformation was complete, but the cost had been absolute. In the grey dawn following Robert Bruce's death, as church bells tolled across Scotland from Edinburgh to the Hebrides, Thomas Randolph stood in the chamber where his king had died, and understood that he now held Scotland's future in his hands. The child David II, all of 5 years old, played with wooden knights in Dunfermline, unaware that his father's death had made him king of a realm surrounded by enemies, waiting for this exact moment of weakness. The Scotland Bruce left behind in 1329 was free but fragile, independent but isolated, victorious but vulnerable. The great king's death removed the force that had held the kingdom together through sheer will and reputation. Now would come the test of whether Bruce had built a nation that could survive its founder. Randolph, whom Bruce had named Guardian, was perhaps the only man in Scotland with the strength and reputation to maintain order. He had taken Edinburgh Castle by climbing its cliff face, had led schiltrons at Bannockburn, had ravaged northern England until his very name brought terror. But holding a kingdom together required different skills than taking castles or winning battles. The first challenge came immediately. Edward Balliol, son of the deposed King John, emerged from obscurity with English backing, claiming he was rightful king. The disinherited, Scottish nobles who had lost lands for opposing Bruce gathered around him, seeing opportunity to reclaim what they had lost. England, while officially maintaining the treaty, secretly supported this threat. The Parliament Randolph called in 1330 showed how quickly unity fractured without Bruce. Nobles who had knelt to Bruce questioned why they should kneel to a child. The Highland clans, always semi-independent, began asserting traditional autonomy. The burghs worried about trade, the church about its privileges, everyone about their own interests rather than Scotland's. Yet Randolph held the centre through force of personality, and Bruce's reflected glory. He had learned from his king that authority came not just from strength, but from justice consistently applied. When the Earl of Mar challenged his regency, Randolph defeated him not through war, but through law, proving in Parliament that Bruce's appointment was valid and binding. The economic policies Randolph pursued continued Bruce's work. Scotland needed prosperity to maintain independence, trade to fund government, agriculture to feed people. The Guardian protected merchants, encouraged immigration to depopulated regions, maintained the currency Bruce had stabilized. Slowly, painfully, Scotland continued its recovery from decades of war. But in July 1332, Randolph died suddenly at Musselburgh, possibly poisoned, though never proven. With him died the last of Bruce's great captains, the final link to Bannockburn's glory. Scotland stood leaderless at the moment when Edward Balliol landed at Kinghorn with army of disinherited, beginning what would be called the Second War of Independence. The Battle of Duplin Moor in August 1332 showed what Scotland had lost with Bruce. The Scottish army, larger than Balliol's force, was destroyed through poor leadership and lack of coordination. The schiltrons that Bruce had made mobile and deadly became death traps when poorly commanded. Thousands died, including the new Guardian, the Earl of Mar. Balliol was crowned at Scone in September, but his kingship rested on English spears. He immediately acknowledged Edward III as overlord, surrendering the independence Bruce had won. He ceded Berwick and substantial territories to England. He was Tomb Tabard reborn, empty coat claiming crown while serving foreign master. Young David II fled to France with his mother, beginning exile that would last 7 years. Scotland seemed to have returned to 1296, conquered, occupied, its independence revealed as temporary illusion, maintained only by one great king's will. But Bruce's true legacy now emerged. He had created not just military victory, but idea of Scotland, consciousness of Scottish identity that survived defeat. Across the kingdom, resistance sparked spontaneously, not organized by nobles or commanded by guardians, but arising from common people who had learned from Bruce that Scotland could be free. Andrew Murray, son of Wallace's co-commander, emerged as leader of resistance. Like Bruce in 1306, he started with nothing but determination. Like Bruce, he understood that Scotland couldn't defeat England in pitched battles, but could make occupation impossible through guerrilla warfare. The lessons Bruce taught lived on in new generation. The siege of Berwick in 1333 brought Edward III directly into the conflict, abandoning pretense that this was internal Scottish dispute. At Halidon Hill, he destroyed Scottish relief force, using tactics learned from studying Bruce's victories: defensive position, coordinated archery, disciplined infantry. Scotland's attempt to fight conventionally failed catastrophically. Yet even this disaster couldn't extinguish what Bruce had ignited. The resistance continued, now truly popular rather than noble-led. Every English garrison faced constant harassment. Every English supply train risked ambush. Every English-held castle became prison for its garrison rather than base for control. The stories of resistance from these years consciously invoked Bruce's memory. When William Douglas, son of James Douglas, recaptured his family castle, he did so using his father's tactics. When Scottish raiders penetrated deep into England, they followed routes Bruce had pioneered. When Scottish parliaments met in defiance of English occupation, they cited precedents Bruce had established. By 1341, young David II could return from France to kingdom that had freed itself through its own efforts. The boy king was weak, impulsive, nothing like his father. Yet the structures Bruce had created, the parliament, the law courts, the concept of community of the realm, survived and functioned despite inadequate leadership. David's reign proved Bruce's wisdom in creating institutions stronger than individuals. When David was captured at Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346, Scotland survived 11 years without its king. When David negotiated shameful terms with England, Scottish Parliament rejected them, asserting rights Declaration of Arbroath had proclaimed, that even kings must serve Scotland's interests. The cultural impact of Bruce's reign flowered in these decades. John Barber's epic poem, The Bruce, written in the 1370s, transformed history into mythology. Bruce became not just successful king, but archetypal Scottish hero. Courageous but cunning, ruthless but righteous, achieving through determination what others failed through strength alone. The poem's Bruce was larger than life, performing feats of impossible heroism. Yet it captured essential truth, that one man's refusal to accept defeat had changed history. The spider story, first recorded by Barber, became Scotland's national parable of persistence. Every Scottish child learned that if at first you don't succeed, try again. Bruce's military innovations continued to influence Scottish warfare for centuries. The mobile schiltron remained Scotland's answer to heavy cavalry until gunpowder made both obsolete. The strategy of destroying castles rather than holding them protected Scotland from occupation long after Bruce's death. The psychological warfare he pioneered, making enemies afraid in their own territory, became permanent Scottish tactic. The diplomatic principles Bruce established, seeking alliance with France against England, maintaining separate Scottish church, asserting Scotland's ancient independence, guided Scottish foreign policy for centuries. Every Scottish king cited precedents Bruce had set. Every Scottish diplomat used arguments Bruce had pioneered. The economic development Bruce initiated, though interrupted by renewed warfare, established patterns that endured. Scottish wool trade with Flanders, Scottish merchants in Baltic ports, Scottish students at European universities, all traced back to relationships Bruce cultivated. He had connected Scotland to Europe in ways that survived political upheavals. The legal reforms Bruce instituted created distinctly Scottish law, different from English common law. His statutes protecting merchants, regularizing justice, limiting arbitrary authority, became foundation of Scottish legal tradition. Centuries later, Scottish lawyers would cite King Robert's laws as fundamental principles. But perhaps Bruce's most enduring legacy was psychological. He had proved that Scotland could defeat England, that independence was achievable, that Scottish identity was worth preserving. This confidence survived every subsequent defeat, every period of occupation, every attempt at conquest. When Scotland faced extinction as independent kingdom, whether from Edward III's invasions, Tudor pressure, or Cromwellian conquest, Bruce's example inspired resistance. When Union of Crowns in 1603 brought Scottish king to English throne, Scots remembered Bruce to maintain distinct identity. When Union of Parliaments in 1707 ended Scottish independence, Bruce's memory kept alive dream of separate Scottish nation. The Protestant Reformation tried to diminish Bruce, tainted by his Catholic context and papal reconciliation. But Protestant Scots simply reimagined him as proto-Protestant hero resisting papal authority. Every generation recreated Bruce in its own image while maintaining core narrative of freedom won against impossible odds. The Enlightenment celebrated Bruce as rational leader who built institutions rather than depending on divine right. Romantics saw him as passionate patriot whose emotions drove great deeds. Victorians portrayed him as embodiment of perseverance and duty. 20th century nationalists invoked him as symbol of Scottish distinctiveness. The modern Scottish independence movement explicitly connects to Bruce's legacy. The declaration of Arbroath's assertion that Scotland exists by consent of its people rather than conquest remains powerful argument. Bruce's transformation from self-serving noble to self-sacrificing patriot provides model for political evolution. Even those opposing Scottish independence acknowledge Bruce's significance. He remains one of few medieval monarchs whose reputation transcends nationalist mythology to achieve universal recognition. His combination of tactical brilliance, strategic patience, and institutional innovation marks him as genuinely transformative leader. The physical monuments to Bruce tell their own story of enduring impact. His statue at Bannockburn, erected in 1964, shows him mounted and ready for battle, eternal guardian of Scottish freedom. His reconstructed face, based on skull excavation, reveals strong, determined features that match historical descriptions. At Dunfermline Abbey, where Bruce's body lies, Scottish kings were crowned beside his tomb for centuries, drawing legitimacy from a proximity to founder of independent Scotland. The inscription, added during the 19th century restoration, reads simply, "Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, 1306 to 1329. But those dates contain epic of transformation. The discovery of Bruce's remains in 1818 became moment of national celebration. His skeleton showed man of impressive stature for his era, with evidence of hard life, broken bones healed, wear from constant armor use, possible signs of leprosy. Physical remains confirmed historical accounts of warrior king who paid bodily price for crown. Modern DNA analysis of Bruce's descendants traces bloodlines across centuries, showing how his genetic legacy spread through Scottish nobility and beyond. But his true descendants are not those sharing his blood, but those sharing his spirit. Every Scot who refuses to accept defeat, who tries one more time when 6 attempts have failed. The spider in the cave, whether historical or mythical, became perfect metaphor for Bruce's legacy. Not the lion rampant of official heraldry, but humble spider spinning patient web captures essence of Bruce's achievement. Success through persistence, victory through refusing to accept defeat. As Scotland continues to debate its future, negotiate its relationship with England, assert its distinct identity, Bruce's legacy remains relevant. The questions he faced, how to achieve independence against stronger power, how to maintain unity among divided people, how to build institutions that outlast individuals, remain Scotland's questions. The legacy of the Lion, for so Bruce was called in his lifetime, is not that he solved these questions permanently, but that he proved they could be solved. He showed that small nations could defeat large ones, that determination could overcome disadvantage, that freedom was achievable for those willing to pay its price. 700 years after Robert Bruce drew his last breath in the museums and monuments of modern Scotland, in the songs still sung and stories still told, the king who should have been forgotten as a failed usurper has instead become immortal. His transformation from historical figure to eternal symbol represents one of history's most complete victories, not of arms, but of imagination, not of conquest, but of consciousness. In Edinburgh Castle, where Bruce never lived, but which his nephew Randolph took by scaling impossible cliffs, tourists gather around a simple crown, sceptre and sword, the honours of Scotland. These symbols of Scottish sovereignty survived English attempts to destroy them, hidden in walls and smuggled through enemy lines, preserved because they represented what Bruce had won: the right of Scotland to crown its own kings. The guide tells the story, worn smooth by repetition, but never losing power. When Robert the Bruce was crowned in 1306, he had no crown jewels, no throne, no treasury. What he had was determination that Scotland should be free. Everything you see here exists because one man refused to accept defeat. Down the Royal Mile in the Scottish Parliament building, opened in 2004 after 300 years of absence, Bruce's words are literally carved in stone. Quotations from the Declaration of Arbroath, the document his chancellors crafted, adorn the walls where modern Scotland governs itself. Members of Scottish Parliament walk past these words daily, reminded that their authority derives from principles Bruce established. The debate over Scottish independence that culminated in the 2014 referendum explicitly invoked Bruce's legacy. Both sides claimed him: nationalists as father of independence, unionists as pragmatist who would recognize modern realities. The very fact that both needed to claim him showed his enduring relevance. In Stirling, beneath the Victorian monument to Wallace, stands the modern monument to Bruce, erected for the 650th anniversary of Bannockburn. The statue shows him mounted, battle-axe raised, forever charging against overwhelming odds. School children on trips pose for pictures, their teachers explaining how one battle changed history. But the statue tells only part of the story. The real monument to Bruce is the battlefield itself, preserved as national shrine. Here, where Scottish spearmen destroyed English chivalry, where David defeated Goliath, where impossible became inevitable, modern Scots come to remember who they are. The visitor centre, with its battle simulation and interactive displays, tries to convey the reality of medieval warfare. But what visitors really come for is the feeling, the connection to moment when everything changed. They stand where Bruce stood, look across the same ground, imagine the thunder of cavalry, the clash of spears, the moment when Edward II fled and Scotland was free. In popular culture, Bruce has achieved apotheosis. The film Braveheart, despite its historical inaccuracies, introduced Bruce to global audience. Though Wallace was the hero, Bruce's transformation from calculating politician to committed king provided the moral arc. His coronation scene, accepting the crown his father never achieved, resonated with audiences who knew nothing of Scottish history. The film Outlaw King attempted more historical accuracy, showing Bruce's guerrilla warfare, the grinding nature of medieval combat, the price of resistance. Yet it too focused on transformation, how suffering and loss forged weak man into strong king. The spider scene, obligatory in any Bruce narrative, showed persistence becoming victory. Scottish folk music keeps Bruce alive in ways academic history cannot. Flower of Scotland, unofficial national anthem, explicitly references Bruce and Bannockburn. When will we see your like again, that fought and died for, your wee bit hill and glen? Sung at rugby matches and independence rallies, it connects modern Scots to medieval struggle. Traditional ballads, passed through generations, tell Bruce stories that history books omit or dispute. The time he worked disguised as blacksmith in English castle. The woman who sheltered him, not knowing who he was, who he later rewarded with lands. The English soldier who recognized him but let him escape, saying one brave man should respect another. These stories, true or not, serve purpose beyond history. They humanize Bruce, making him accessible to ordinary people. Not distant king, but clever survivor. Not perfect hero, but flawed man who kept trying. Every Scottish family seems to have Bruce story, some connection, however tenuous, to the great king. In academia, Bruce studies have evolved from hagiography through skepticism to sophisticated appreciation. Modern historians recognize him as genuinely transformative figure who fundamentally altered British history. Without Bruce, Scotland likely would have been absorbed into England like Wales, creating different Britain, different empire, different world. The economic historians study his fiscal innovations, how he funded independence through combination of taxation, confiscation, and trade promotion. Military historians analyze his tactical innovations, his understanding of terrain and psychology. Political scientists examine his institutional creativity, his concept of kingship by consent rather than pure heredity. But it's the cultural historians who perhaps best understand Bruce's achievement. He created not just independent Scotland, but idea of Scotland, narrative of Scottish exceptionalism that survived political union, industrial revolution, imperial absorption, and globalization. The Bruce sites across Scotland form pilgrimage route for those seeking connection to Scottish identity. Turnberry Castle, where he was likely born, now ruined, but still overlooking the sea. Lochmaben Castle, his family's ancestral seat. The caves of Arran and Rathlin, where he supposedly hid. Each site has its legends, its ghost stories, its claims to authentic Bruce experience. At Melrose Abbey, where his heart was finally buried after its Spanish adventure, people leave flowers and Scottish flags. The inscription reads, "A noble heart may have none ease, gif freedom faile." A noble heart can have no ease if freedom fails. It captures Bruce's restless spirit, never satisfied with partial victory, always pushing for complete independence. The archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new aspects of Bruce's world. Excavations at battle sites using modern techniques show the brutality of medieval warfare. Crushed skulls, severed limbs, evidence of deaths more horrible than chronicles describe. Yet they also show the sophistication, organized battle lines, coordinated tactics, strategic thinking that Hollywood simplifies. The discovery of possible Bruce manuscripts, letters in his own hand rather than dictated to scribes, would revolutionize understanding of his personality. The search continues in archives across Europe, looking for documents that might reveal the man behind the myth. DNA studies of Bruce's descendants have traced his genetic legacy across centuries and continents. Scottish diaspora carried his bloodline to America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Millions claim descent from Bruce, though proving connections across 7 centuries remains challenging. But biological descent matters less than spiritual inheritance. Every Scottish child who learns the spider story, every immigrant who carries Scottish identity to new lands, every person who refuses to accept defeat becomes Bruce's heir. The modern Scottish government consciously invokes Bruce in its symbolism and rhetoric. State occasions reference Bannockburn. International negotiations cite Declaration of Arbroath. The First Minister's residence displays Bruce artifacts. The continuity is deliberate, connecting modern Scotland to medieval precedent. Even Scottish regiments in British Army maintain Bruce connections. Battle honours trace back to medieval victories. Regimental marches include tunes supposedly played at Bannockburn. Soldiers swear oaths that echo Bruce's time. The warrior tradition he embodied continues in professional military service. The Scottish diaspora, estimated at 40 million people worldwide, maintains Bruce memory in unexpected places. Scottish societies from Hong Kong to Buenos Aires celebrate Bannockburn Anniversary. Highland Games in American South include lectures on Bruce's tactics. Canadian provinces with Scottish settlement name towns after Bruce battles. The ghost of Bruce even haunts English consciousness. He remains the enemy who got away, the defeat that rankles, the proof that English dominance was never inevitable. English historians increasingly recognize him as worthy adversary whose victory shaped English history too. The European Union debates referenced Bruce and Declaration of Arbroath in discussing sovereignty and self-determination. The principle that legitimate government requires consent of governed, which Bruce's propagandists articulated, became foundation of democratic theory. International law scholars cite Scottish wars of independence when discussing rights of small nations against larger powers. Bruce's combination of military resistance and diplomatic engagement provides model for modern independence movements. The ghost of Robert Bruce would not die because what he represented transcended his historical moment. Not just Scottish independence, but human refusal to accept oppression. Not just military victory, but triumph of will over circumstances. Not just medieval kingship, but timeless principles of freedom and determination. As midnight approaches in the great hall of Edinburgh Castle, where state banquets are still held beneath ancient banners, where the honours of Scotland rest behind bulletproof glass, where modern Scotland celebrates its achievements and mourns its losses, the portrait of Robert the Bruce looks down with eyes that seem to follow every visitor. Painted centuries after his death by artists who never knew his face, the portrait nevertheless captures something essential. The unwavering gaze of a man who looked at impossible odds and saw opportunity. Tonight, as on every June 23rd, a ceremony takes place that tourists never see, that no cameras record. The Regiment of Scotland, heir to centuries of Scottish military tradition, holds its Bannockburn vigil. Soldiers in modern combat uniforms stand where medieval knights once stood, remembering not just a battle, but a moment when everything seemed lost, and yet was won. The commanding officer reads from Barber's Bruce the same words soldiers have heard for generations. Freedom is a noble thing. Freedom makes man to have liking. Freedom all solace to man gives. He lives at ease that freely lives. The words, archaic in language but eternal in meaning, remind these modern warriors that they inherit tradition stretching back 7 centuries. This continuity, from medieval schiltrons to modern regiment, from Bruce's desperate guerrilla warfare to Scotland's place in modern democracy, represents the ultimate victory of the king who would not yield. He created not just a free Scotland, but an idea of Scotland that survived every subsequent catastrophe. When the wars of independence ended, Scotland had perhaps 500,000 people, devastated lands, ruined economy, uncertain future. Today, Scotland's population exceeds 5 million. Its economy generates hundreds of billions in GDP. Its universities lead world research. Its culture influences global imagination. None of this was inevitable. All of it connects to decision made in 1306 by one man to claim a crown that seemed impossible to win. The transformation from Robert Bruce the man to Robert Bruce the symbol happened gradually, but inevitably. Each generation found in him what it needed. Medieval Scots saw victorious warrior. Reformation Scots discovered proto-Protestant resistor. Enlightenment Scots recognized rational institution builder. Romantic Scots embraced passionate patriot. Modern Scots see complex figure navigating between principle and pragmatism. But certain core elements remain constant across interpretations. The spider teaching persistence, the murder of Comyn showing that even heroes have dark moments, the wandering in the heather demonstrating that failure need not be final, the victory at Bannockburn proving that David can defeat Goliath, the death from disease reminding that all human achievement is temporary. In Scottish schools, children still learn Bruce's story, though now with more nuance than previous generations. They learn about his betrayals as well as his victories, his cruelties as well as his courage. They discover that heroes are complex, that freedom requires difficult choices, that building nations demands both vision and compromise. The curriculum includes visits to Bruce sites, not as patriotic indoctrination, but as historical education. Students stand at Bannockburn trying to understand medieval warfare. They climb to Edinburgh Castle, imagining Randolph's assault. They read the Declaration of Arbroath, analysing its political philosophy. They debate whether Bruce was freedom fighter or terrorist, nation builder or self-serving opportunist. These debates themselves prove Bruce's victory, that Scotland exists as distinct entity with its own history to debate, its own heroes to evaluate, its own identity to assert. This is what Bruce achieved. Not answers, but the right to ask questions, not solutions, but the sovereignty to seek them. The modern Scottish legal system, distinct from English law, traces directly to Bruce's reforms. When Scottish advocates argue in Edinburgh's Court of Session, they cite precedents stretching back to statutes Bruce enacted. The principle that Scottish law serves Scottish people, not imposed external authority, was established by Bruce and survives today. Scottish universities, among world's oldest and most prestigious, owe their existence partly to Bruce's emphasis on education. He understood that independence required not just military victory, but intellectual infrastructure. The clerks and lawyers he trained established tradition of Scottish learning that produced Enlightenment thinkers, industrial innovators, modern Nobel laureates. The Scottish Parliament, reconvened in 1999 after 3-century absence, explicitly connects to parliaments Bruce summoned. The opening ceremony included reading from Declaration of Arbroath. The parliamentary mace includes symbols from Bruce's reign. The very existence of separate Scottish legislature fulfills vision Bruce articulated. Even Scotland's economic strategy, emphasizing innovation, education, international connection, echoes Bruce's policies. He understood that small nations must be clever, must punch above their weight, must find niches where size doesn't determine success. Modern Scotland's achievements in biotechnology, renewable energy, financial services follow patterns Bruce established. The Scottish diaspora, forced by clearances, famine, economic hardship to scatter across globe, carried Bruce's memory with them. In North Carolina's Cape Fear Valley, Scottish settlers named towns after Bruce battles. In New Zealand's Otago region, Scottish immigrants told Bruce stories to their colonial-born children. In India's tea plantations, Scottish administrators named estates after Bruce victories. This global spread of Bruce's legend created international constituency for Scottish identity. When Scotland seeks international recognition, whether in EU negotiations or UN deliberations, it finds sympathy partly because Bruce's story resonates universally. Every nation that struggled for independence recognizes the spider in the cave, the wanderer in the heather, the victor at Bannockburn. The cultural productions inspired by Bruce continue proliferating. Historical novels reimagine his story for each generation. Television series explore political complexities behind the legend. Video games let players experience medieval Scotland, making tactical decisions Bruce faced. Each iteration introduces Bruce to new audiences, ensuring the ghost continues walking. Tourism based on Bruce generates millions for Scottish economy. The Bannockburn Visitor Centre, using latest technology, creates immersive experience of medieval battle. The Bruce Trail, connecting sites associated with his life, attracts hikers from worldwide. Hotels and restaurants themed around Bruce offer medieval experiences that would bewilder actual medieval Scots but serve modern hunger for historical connection. Academic conferences regularly convene to debate Bruce's legacy. Historians from multiple nations examine his military innovations, political philosophy, economic policies. These scholarly discussions, published in journals few read, nevertheless shape how future generations will understand Bruce. The academic Bruce, complex, contradictory, compelling, may be truest to historical reality. Archaeological investigations continue revealing Bruce's world. Ground-penetrating radar at Bannockburn shows battle developed differently than traditional accounts suggest. Excavations at Bruce Castle sites reveal daily life details: what they ate, what they wore, how they lived. Each discovery adds nuance to understanding of Bruce's achievement. Climate scientists studying medieval weather patterns help explain Bruce's strategic decisions. The mild weather of early 14th century made Scottish Highlands more habitable, supporting guerrilla warfare. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 affected military operations. Environmental factors Bruce couldn't control, but successfully navigated shaped his victory. Medical historians analyzing descriptions of Bruce's final illness offer new interpretations. Perhaps not leprosy, but tuberculosis, psoriasis, or other condition. The physical suffering he endured while maintaining kingdom adds poignancy to his achievement. That he accomplished so much while possibly in constant pain makes him more human, more admirable. Modern leadership studies use Bruce as case study in transformation. How did calculating politician become inspiring leader? What experiences forged his character? How did he maintain loyalty through disasters? Business schools examine his strategic thinking. Military academies study his tactical innovations. Political scientists analyze his institution building. Psychological profiles of Bruce, based on historical evidence, suggest complex personality, combining high intelligence with emotional intensity. His ability to learn from failure, to adapt strategies, to delay gratification for long-term goals, marks him as exceptional leader by any era's standards. His possible depression following family deaths, his apparent acceptance of approaching death, his concern for posthumous reputation, reveal deeply human figure behind heroic facade. The philosophical implications of Bruce's kingship continue generating discussion. His assertion that authority derived from community consent rather than divine appointment challenged medieval assumptions. The contractual monarchy he created, where king served nation rather than nation serving king, presaged democratic developments. Modern political theorists trace concepts of popular sovereignty partly to precedents Bruce established. International law scholars cite Bruce when discussing self-determination's rights. His combination of military resistance and diplomatic engagement, his appeal to universal principles while pursuing particular interests, his transformation of rebellion into legitimate governance, provide templates for modern independence movements. The Scottish precedent Bruce established influenced decolonization, shaped UN Charter, continues affecting international relations. Environmental historians note Bruce's relationship with Scottish landscape. His use of terrain in warfare, his understanding of seasonal patterns, his ability to disappear into wilderness when needed show intimate knowledge of natural environment. The Scotland he defended was not abstract political entity, but actual glens and mountains, rivers and islands. His connection to land itself, beyond political structures, resonates with modern environmental consciousness. Gender historians examine women's roles in Bruce's story, often marginalized in traditional accounts. His wife Elizabeth's 8 years of imprisonment, his sister Mary's cage exposure, his daughter Marjorie's confinement. These women paid terrible prices for Bruce's ambition. Yet women also enabled his success. Isabella Macduff crowning him, his mother protecting his childhood, countless unnamed women who sheltered, fed, informed his forces. Recovering these female contributions enriches understanding of Bruce's achievement. The religious dimensions of Bruce's reign deserve renewed attention. His excommunication and reconciliation, his deathbed crusading vow, his relationship with Scottish clergy reveal medieval Christianity's complexity. Bruce somehow maintained divine right kingship while asserting contractual monarchy, claimed God's support while acknowledging human agency. These theological tensions anticipate later Scottish religious distinctiveness. As Scotland faces contemporary challenges, economic uncertainty, demographic change, constitutional questions, Bruce's example remains relevant. Not as simple inspiration, but as complex case study in navigating between ideal and possible. He compromised when necessary, stood firm when essential, always kept ultimate goal in sight, even when immediate paths seemed blocked. The spider in the cave, trying 7 times to attach its web, becomes metaphor not just for persistence, but for intelligent adaptation. Each attempt taught something, refined technique, until success became possible. Bruce's failures, Methven, Dalry, his brother's executions, were not just obstacles overcome, but lessons learned, prices paid for eventual victory. The king who would not yield, yielded constantly, to circumstances, to necessity, to political reality. But he never yielded on essential point, Scotland's right to exist as independent nation. Everything else, personal honour, family safety, religious standing, could be sacrificed. But Scotland's freedom was non-negotiable. This distinction between tactical flexibility and strategic determination defines Bruce's legacy. He showed that small nations need not accept subjugation, that military weakness can be overcome through superior strategy, that patient construction beats passionate destruction. The lessons remain valid whether applied to national independence, personal challenges, or collective struggles. As dawn approaches over Scotland, as it has for 700 years since Bruce's death, the nation he created continues evolving. No longer the medieval kingdom he knew, it nevertheless carries DNA he implanted, distinctive identity, stubborn independence of spirit, confidence that small nations can achieve great things. In cemeteries across Scotland lie generations who lived free because Bruce won. In classrooms sit children who learn their own history because Bruce preserved it. In Parliament, deliberate representatives who govern by consent because Bruce established the principle. In hearts beat Scottish identity because Bruce refused to let it die. The man who murdered Comyn in sacred space created sacred nation. The king who broke every oath established inviolable principles. The leader who failed repeatedly achieved permanent success. The dying leper gave birth to immortal legend. These paradoxes capture Bruce's complexity, his humanity, his greatness. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots from 1306 to 1329, remains alive in every Scottish achievement, every assertion of Scottish distinctiveness, every refusal to accept defeat as final. He was not perfect hero, but flawed human who transcended limitations through determination. Not inevitable victor, but persistent fighter who turned defeats into education. The crown he won came at terrible price. Everything he loved sacrificed for dream of freedom. But from that sacrifice came nation that endured, identity that survived, spirit that refused to yield. The king who would not yield yielded his life, but not his vision. 7 centuries later, that vision lives on, in stone and story, in lore and legend, in the unconquered soul of Scotland. The spider still spins its web, the king still leads the charge, the nation still stands free. And somewhere in the Scottish mist, between history and legend, between memory and dream, Robert the Bruce continues his eternal vigil, watching over the land he loved more than life, the freedom he won through refusing to yield, the Scotland that exists because one man looked at impossible odds and saw not defeat, but opportunity. The story ends as it began, with a choice. In 1306, Robert Bruce chose to claim a crown that seemed impossible to win. Today, Scotland chooses how to honour that legacy, how to apply those lessons, how to continue the eternal struggle between freedom and subjugation, between independence and absorption, between yielding and standing firm. The king who would not yield has yielded the stage to history. But his spirit remains in every Scot who refuses to accept defeat, in every small nation that asserts its dignity, in every human heart that values freedom above comfort. He was born Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick. He died Robert I, King of Scots. He lives forever as the man who proved that determination can defeat power, that patience can outlast strength, that freedom is indeed worth any price. The crown sits secure now in Edinburgh Castle, protected and preserved. But the real crown, the one Bruce truly won, rests not in museum case, but in Scottish consciousness, the crown of freedom, of identity, of the right to be who they are, rather than what others would make them. That crown cannot be stolen, cannot be destroyed, cannot be yielded. For as long as Scotland remembers Bruce, as long as the children hear the spider story, as long as anyone anywhere refuses to accept defeat as final, the king who would not yield continues his reign, eternal and undefeated, in the one realm that truly matters, the unconquerable human spirit that chooses freedom over submission, persistence over surrender, hope over despair. And so the story ends where it truly begins, not with death, but with immortality, not with conclusion, but with continuation, not with yielding, but with eternal resistance. Robert the Bruce is dead. Long live the king who would not yield. Some argued for withdrawal. They had blooded English pride, proven Scottish courage. Why risk everything in pitched battle? But Bruce understood what others didn't. Scotland needed more than moral victory. It needed decisive triumph that would force England to acknowledge defeat. "Look at where they camp," Bruce told his lieutenants, pointing to the English fires, flickering like fallen stars in the cars. Hemmed by water, on soft ground that will turn to bog when churned by horses, they've trapped themselves. Tomorrow, we attack. The decision stunned even his veterans. Scottish armies defended. They didn't attack forces 3 times their size. But Bruce had studied every English victory and defeat. He knew that on constrained ground, numbers became liability. He knew that English arrogance would make them slow to adapt. Most importantly, he knew his men would fight harder attacking for freedom than defending against conquest. Dawn of June 24th, the feast of St. John the Baptist, came with mist rising from the burns like the breath of the earth itself. The Scottish army heard Mass, each man kneeling on the hillside, making peace with God before the storm. Edward II, watching from across the field, reportedly said, "See, they kneel to beg mercy." "They kneel to God, not to you," replied one of his nobles who understood Scots better. "These men will win this day or die." Then the Scots did something that stunned the English army. They advanced, not in defensive formation, not reluctantly, but in disciplined attack. The Schiltrons came forward in echelon, Randolph on the left, Edward Bruce in the centre, Douglas on the right, each slightly behind and offset from the next, creating a diagonal line that would strike in sequence rather than simultaneously. The English, cramped in their chosen position between the burns, tried to organize response, but there wasn't room. Knights pushed against infantry, horses trampled their own men trying to form up. Archers couldn't find clear fields of fire without hitting their own forces. What should have been disciplined deployment became desperate scramble. The Earl of Gloucester, young and eager for glory after yesterday's humiliations, didn't wait for orders. He led his household knights in an immediate charge at Edward Bruce's advancing Schiltron. It was magnificent. 500 of England's finest thundering across the cars, lances levelled, certain their charge would shatter Scottish peasants. But these weren't peasants, and this wasn't typical ground. The horses, already struggling in soil softer than it appeared, slowed as they approached. The Schiltron didn't waver, didn't break, didn't even pause. Gloucester's charge hit the wall of spears and died. The Earl himself, one of England's richest nobles, was pulled from his horse and killed before anyone realized who he was. No ransom, just another dead invader. As more English cavalry piled into the killing ground, trying to break the Scottish formations through sheer weight, the ground itself became their enemy. Thousands of hooves churned the cars into mud. Horses slipped, fell, threw their riders. The burns that had seemed minor obstacles became death traps as armoured men tried to cross them. Bruce watched the battle developing exactly as planned. The English were committed, compressed, confused. Now came the masterstroke. The English archers, those battle winners who had destroyed Wallace at Falkirk, were trying to position themselves on the flank where they could rain arrows on the Schiltrons. Bruce had held his small cavalry force for precisely this moment. Robert Keith's 500 light horsemen burst from the trees where they had hidden through the night. They struck the English archers like a thunderbolt. The archers, focused on the Schiltrons, had no protection against cavalry. They broke immediately, fleeing in panic, many drowning in the Bannockburn, or the Forth as they tried to escape. Without their archers, the English had no answer to the steadily advancing schiltrons. The Scottish formations pressed forward relentlessly, spears finding gaps in armour, pushing the English back toward the burns. The compression became catastrophic. Men couldn't fight, couldn't flee, could only die where they stood. At the battle's climax, Bruce committed his reserve. But more significantly, at this moment, the small folk, the Scottish camp followers, servants and local farmers who had gathered to watch, appeared on Gillies Hill behind the Scottish army. They had made banners from blankets and sheets, and to the exhausted, terrified English, they looked like a fresh Scottish army. "We are betrayed! Another army comes!" The cry spread through English ranks already wavering. Panic, once started, spread like wildfire. Men who, moments before, had been fighting desperately, now thought only of escape. Edward II, watching his army disintegrate, made the decision that would haunt him forever. He fled. The King of England, heir to the great Edward Longshanks, turned his horse and ran from Scottish spearmen. His royal standard departing was the signal for complete collapse. "The king flies! Save yourselves!" The English army, leaderless and surrounded, shattered completely. What followed was less battle than massacre. Knights threw away armour to run faster. Noble men-at-arms fought each other for access to the few bridges. Many tried to swim the Forth in their armour and sank immediately. The burns ran red with blood, bodies piling so thick men could cross on corpses without touching water. The Scottish pursuit was relentless but focused. Bruce had given specific orders. Edward II must not be captured. A captive English king would unite England in rescue attempts. A humiliated, fled king would divide England in recrimination and blame. James Douglas pursued Edward for 60 miles with a small force, always close enough to terrorize, never quite catching him, though whether by design or fortune remains debated. Edward II barely escaped, reaching Dunbar Castle and taking ship for England, leaving behind his seal, his shield, his royal dignity. The English baggage train, with supplies for conquering Scotland, instead supplied Scotland for years. The royal seal Bruce captured would be returned to England, a gesture of contempt more cutting than keeping it. When sunset came on June 24th, 1314, the field of Bannockburn was carpeted with English dead. An earl, 38 barons, hundreds of knights, thousands of infantry. The cream of English chivalry lay dead or captured. The ransom of prisoners would fund Scotland for years. But Bruce was selective. Common soldiers were released freely, spreading tales of Scottish mercy and English disaster. The victory was total, unprecedented, unbelievable. Scotland hadn't just defended against invasion. It had attacked and destroyed the greatest English army ever sent north. Common spearmen had defeated noble cavalry. A kingdom given up for lost had risen to crush its conquerors. That night, as Scottish soldiers collected English armour and weapons, as they tended wounded and counted dead, as they slowly realized the magnitude of their achievement, Robert Bruce walked among them. No longer the desperate usurper of 1306, no longer the guerrilla chief of 1307, but truly King of Scots, proven in battle, validated by victory. Yet even in triumph, Bruce showed the wisdom that separated him from mere warlords. He ordered English dead buried with dignity. He treated noble prisoners according to their rank. He sent physicians to tend English wounded. The message was clear. This was not vengeance, but justice, not hatred, but determination to be free. Bruce gathered his commanders as stars emerged over the battlefield. "Today we have won a great victory," he said, "but wars are not won in a day. England will return, if not this year, then next. We must be ready, always ready. But tonight, let Scotland rejoice. We have shown the world that we will not yield, cannot be conquered, will be free." The field of Bannockburn, which had dawned as potential disaster, ended as eternal glory. The battle would echo through centuries, inspiring Scots in dark times with memory of when they stood against impossible odds and prevailed. It would become more than history. It would become mythology, the defining moment when Scotland proved it deserved to exist. But for Bruce, Bannockburn was not an ending, but a beginning. He had won the war's greatest battle, but peace would require different victories. He had proven he could destroy English armies, but could he build a Scottish nation? He had shown he could win freedom, but could he preserve it? These questions would drive the remaining 15 years of his reign, but on this night, they could wait. Tonight, Scotland was free. Bruce was truly king, and the impossible had become reality on the field of glory by the Bannockburn. In the cold January of 1315, as snow blanketed the Scottish Highlands, Robert Bruce stood in the great hall of Scone Palace and made a decision that would either secure Scotland's independence forever or destroy everything Bannockburn had won. Before him knelt his last surviving brother, Edward Bruce, about to receive a commission that would extend the war beyond Scotland's borders and challenge English power across the Irish Sea. "Brother," Robert said, placing his hands on Edward's shoulders, "I name you my heir and send you to Ireland not as conqueror, but as liberator. The Irish suffer under the same English yoke we have thrown off. Unite them as I united Scotland, and England will face war on two fronts, unable to sustain either." It was brilliant strategy, but desperate gamble. Scotland had won freedom, but not peace. Edward II, though humiliated at Bannockburn, refused to recognize Scottish independence. He rebuilt his armies, strengthened his border castles, imposed economic blockade. Scotland was free but strangled, independent but isolated. Bruce needed to force England to the negotiating table, and Ireland was the hammer that would strike the English anvil. Edward Bruce landed at Larne in May 1315 with 6,000 Scottish veterans, men who had stood in the schiltrons at Bannockburn, who had taken English castles thought impregnable. The Irish chiefs who greeted them saw not foreign invaders, but Celtic brothers come to help throw off Anglo-Norman domination that had oppressed Ireland for over a century. The campaign began brilliantly. Edward Bruce defeated Anglo-Irish forces at Connaught, at Kells, at Ardscoil. Irish chiefs who had feuded for generations united behind this Scottish prince who spoke their Gaelic tongue, who promised to drive the English into the sea. Within a year, Edward was crowned High King of Ireland at Dundalk, the first to claim that title with real power in living memory. Back in Scotland, Robert Bruce used his brother's Irish campaign to devastating effect. With English forces divided between two fronts, he launched the most destructive raids into northern England ever attempted. The names James Douglas and Thomas Randolph became terrors that English mothers used to quiet children. Be good, or the Black Douglas will come for you. These weren't random raids, but calculated destruction of English military capacity. The Scottish forces, moving fast with minimal baggage, could strike deep into England before defence could be organised. They burned crops, destroyed mills, seized livestock, and most importantly, extracted tribute. Northern English towns paid thousands of pounds for temporary truces, gold that funded Scotland's government and military. The raid of 1315 penetrated as far as Yorkshire. Douglas burned villages within sight of York's walls, while English forces chased shadows in Cumberland. The raid of 1316 reached Durham, where Randolph defeated a hastily assembled English army and extracted ransom that would have funded a small kingdom. The raid of 1318 saw both Douglas and Randolph operating independently, forcing England to divide its forces, achieving nothing against either. The psychological impact was devastating. Northern England, which had been the stable base for invasions of Scotland, became a wasteland. Nobles abandoned their estates for the safety of the south. Merchants moved their businesses away from the border. The economic powerhouse that had funded Edward I's conquests became a drain on the English treasury. But Ireland proved harder to hold than to conquer. Edward Bruce had his brother's courage, but not his wisdom. Where Robert had learned to balance mercy with might, Edward ruled through fear alone. He alienated Irish allies through harsh demands, failed to understand the complex web of Irish politics, made enemies where he should have made friends. The Great Famine that struck Europe in 1315 to 1317 hit Ireland particularly hard. Crops failed, cattle died, people starved. Edward Bruce's Scottish army, living off the land, became seen not as liberators, but as additional mouths consuming scarce food. Irish chiefs who had welcomed him began to reconsider their allegiance. In October 1318, at Faughart near Dundalk, Edward Bruce made his last stand. Facing a coalition of Anglo-Irish lords and disillusioned Irish chiefs, outnumbered 3-1, he could have retreated, preserved his force, continued guerrilla warfare. But Edward was not Robert. He chose glorious death over strategic withdrawal. The battle was brief and brutal. Edward Bruce died as he had lived, courageously, foolishly, his head later sent to Edward II as trophy. With him died the dream of Celtic alliance against English power. The Scots withdrew from Ireland, their 3-year campaign ending in failure that negated many of Bannockburn's gains. Robert Bruce received news of his brother's death with stoic grief. Edward had been impetuous, often irritating, but he was the last of Bruce's brothers, all others having died for Scottish independence. More critically, Edward's death created succession crisis. Bruce had no legitimate son, only a daughter, Marjorie, who had died in childbirth, leaving an infant son, Robert Stuart. But Bruce had learned from every setback to emerge stronger. He used Edward's death to negotiate from a position of tragic strength rather than weakness. He sent message to Edward II. We have both lost brothers to this war. How many more must die before we acknowledge what battle has already proven? That Scotland is free. The English response came not through diplomacy, but through one last invasion. In 1322, Edward II assembled another great army, convinced that with Edward Bruce dead and Scotland weakened by famine, victory was finally possible. He marched north with 20,000 men, penetrating deep into Lothian. But Bruce had perfected the strategy of defensive destruction. As English forces advanced, they found nothing, no food, no fodder, no Scots to fight. Bruce had evacuated the entire population, driving livestock into the hills, burning what couldn't be carried, poisoning wells. The English army, expecting to live off the land, instead began to starve. When Edward II reached Edinburgh, he found a dead city. Even rats had abandoned it. His army, hungry and demoralized, began the inevitable retreat. And then Bruce struck. At Byland in Yorkshire, the retreating English were surprised by a Scottish force that had somehow gotten ahead of them. Edward II fled so fast he left his personal belongings, his seal, even his armor. The humiliation was complete. Edward II had invaded Scotland with overwhelming force and retreated without fighting a significant battle, defeated by absence rather than presence. His nobles, disgusted by repeated failure, began plotting his overthrow. Bruce, understanding that military victory meant nothing without diplomatic recognition, intensified his political campaign. The Declaration of Arbroath, sent to Pope John XXII in 1320, was masterpiece of medieval diplomacy. Written in eloquent Latin by Bruce's chancellor, it argued Scotland's case not through legal precedent, but through moral authority. As long as 100 of us remain alive, we will never consent to subject ourselves to English dominion. It is not for glory, riches, or honours that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life. The Declaration was revolutionary in its philosophy. It stated that Bruce ruled not by divine right, but by consent of the community of the realm. If he betrayed Scotland's independence, the nobles would choose another king. This concept of conditional monarchy, of social contract between ruler and ruled, was centuries ahead of its time. Slowly, gradually, the diplomatic tide turned. The Pope, needing Scottish support against various enemies, began addressing Bruce as King of Scots. France renewed the old alliance, recognizing Scottish independence. Even in England, voices began suggesting that perpetual war with Scotland served no purpose except draining English blood and treasure. The coup that overthrew Edward II in 1327 brought dramatic change. His son, Edward III, was minor. Real power held by his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. They needed peace to consolidate their regime, were willing to be pragmatic where Edward II had been stubborn. Negotiations began in earnest. Bruce, now 53 and suffering from illness that was probably leprosy, knew he was running out of time. He needed treaty not for himself, but for Scotland, for his 5-year-old son, David, who would inherit a crown that must be secure. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, signed in 1328, was total Scottish victory. England recognized Scottish independence unconditionally, renounced all claims to overlordship, agreed to marriage alliance between Bruce's son David and Edward III's sister Joan. It was everything Bruce had fought for, achieved not through one great victory, but through 22 years of relentless pressure. Bruce witnessed the treaty from his sickbed at Cardross, too ill to travel. The hammer of Irish campaign had failed, but the anvil of Scottish resistance had proven unbreakable. England had finally accepted what Bannockburn had demonstrated, that Scotland would never yield, would accept destruction rather than subjugation. As Bruce lay dying in June 1329, he could reflect on extraordinary achievement. He had inherited a conquered nation and left a free kingdom. He had begun as self-serving noble and ended as father of Scottish independence. Every disaster had taught him lesson. Every victory had brought him wisdom. Every sacrifice had built toward this moment when Scotland stood free among nations. His last command was that his heart be carried on crusade, fulfilling vow he couldn't keep in life. James Douglas would carry that heart into battle against the Moors in Spain, dying in the attempt, but ensuring his king's spirit fought for Christendom even after death. The hammer and anvil years had forged Scotland into a nation that could survive its founder's death. Bruce had created not just military victory, but institutions, laws, and above all, national consciousness that would endure. Scotland was free not because one man had won battles, but because an entire nation had refused to yield. In the shadowed chamber of Cambus Kenneth Abbey, where candles flickered against stone walls that had witnessed centuries of Scottish prayers, Robert Bruce sat with his chancellor, Bernard de Linton, through the long nights of 1319, weaving words into weapons more powerful than any sword. The ink that flowed from their quills would reach the courts of Europe, spinning a web of diplomacy that would trap England as surely as Scottish spears had trapped them at Bannockburn. "Words, Your Grace," Linton said, his scholarly face intent over parchment, "can breach walls that armies cannot scale. We must make Scotland's cause Europe's cause, transform our struggle from rebellion to righteousness." Bruce, his body already showing signs of the illness that would eventually claim him, understood what his chancellor meant. Military victory had won Scotland freedom, but only diplomatic recognition could preserve it. The letters they crafted that winter would travel to Paris, Rome, Norway, carrying Scotland's voice to powers that could pressure England in ways Scottish armies never could. The diplomatic campaign Bruce orchestrated was revolutionary for its sophistication. Medieval diplomacy was typically about dynastic claims and legal precedents. Bruce made it about principles, freedom, justice, the right of peoples to choose their rulers. He transformed Scotland from rebellious province to sovereign nation in the imagination of Europe. To Philip V of France, Bruce wrote of shared struggle against English aggression. The Old Alliance, that ancient friendship between Scotland and France, born of mutual need against common enemy, was renewed and strengthened. French ships began arriving in Scottish ports, bringing wine and weapons, carrying away wool and promises of military coordination. The relationship with France was complex, often disappointing. French kings promised much but delivered little, using Scotland as useful distraction for English ambitions rather than genuine ally deserving support. Yet Bruce understood even empty promises had value. They forced England to consider French intervention, to maintain forces in the south that might otherwise march north. To the Hanseatic League, those powerful German merchant cities that controlled Baltic trade, Bruce offered different inducement. Scotland had wool, hides, fish, commodities the Hanse needed. England tried to blockade Scottish trade, but Hanseatic ships, protected by their collective might, began calling at Scottish ports. Each cargo that sailed was economic victory, proof that Scotland could survive English embargo. But it was the papacy that became Bruce's most crucial diplomatic battlefield. The Pope claimed spiritual authority over all Christendom, could excommunicate kings, could declare crusades. Bruce's excommunication for Comyn's murder remained his greatest weakness. How could other Christian monarchs recognize a king the Church condemned? The campaign to lift Bruce's excommunication was masterwork of medieval persuasion. Scottish bishops, technically forbidden from supporting excommunicated king, found creative interpretations of canon law. They argued Comyn had been traitor, that his death, while regrettable in sacred space, was justified by his crimes. They sent gifts to Rome, not bribes, of course, but donations to demonstrate Scottish piety. The Pope, John XXII, was himself embattled, facing opposition from the Holy Roman Emperor, needing allies wherever he could find them. Bruce's representatives whispered that Scotland, if recognized, would support papal causes, would send men for crusades, would be faithful son of church. Gradually, the papal position softened. The Declaration of Arbroath, sent to Pope John XXII in 1320, was culmination of this diplomatic offensive. But it was more than plea for recognition. It was philosophical revolution disguised as petition. The document, signed by 39 Scottish nobles and sealed with their arms, made arguments that would echo through centuries. We fight not for glory, nor riches, nor honours, but for freedom alone. This was radical. Medieval nobles were supposed to fight precisely for glory, riches, and honours. To claim higher motivation was to challenge entire basis of feudal society. More revolutionary was the Declaration's assertion about kingship. If this prince, Robert Bruce, shall leave these principles he hath so nobly pursued, and consent that we or our kingdom be subjected to the king or people of England, we will immediately endeavour to expel him as our enemy, and as the subverter of both his own and our rights, and we will choose another king. This was extraordinary. The idea that nobles could depose a king who betrayed national interest, that kingship was conditional on performance, that sovereignty ultimately rested with community of realm rather than divine appointment. It wouldn't be fully realized for centuries, but seeds of constitutional monarchy were planted in that document. Bruce also pioneered what might be called public diplomacy. He ensured Scottish merchants in foreign ports told Scotland's story. Scottish students at European universities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford before the wars, carried narratives of Scottish struggle. Travelling minstrels sang of Bannockburn in courts from Ireland to Italy. The story Bruce told was carefully crafted. Scotland wasn't aggressor, but victim. Bruce hadn't murdered Comyn, but executed traitor. The wars weren't rebellion, but resistance to foreign oppression. Every raid into England was retaliation for English aggression. It was propaganda, but effective propaganda built on enough truth to be credible. Bruce also used marriage diplomacy with sophistication. His sister Mary was married to Neil Campbell, creating loyal allies in the West. His daughter Marjorie married Walter Stewart, binding that powerful family to Bruce's cause. When Marjorie died in childbirth, her infant son, Robert Stewart, became heir after David, creating succession that would eventually produce Stewart dynasty. The marriage negotiations for his son David were particularly complex. Bruce needed alliance with England to secure peace, but couldn't appear to be submitting. The solution was masterful. David would marry Joan, sister of Edward III, but as equals, Scottish king to English princess, not vassal to overlord's relative. The negotiations took years, every detail scrutinized for implications of sovereignty. Bruce even used his enemies diplomatically. When he captured English nobles, he treated them with elaborate courtesy, allowing them to write home about Scottish civilization, Scottish honour. When he returned Edward II's captured seal after English defeats, it was gesture of contempt, but also communication. Scotland was confident enough to be magnanimous. The economic diplomacy Bruce pursued was equally sophisticated. He understood that Scotland's economy was its weakness, smaller, poorer than England, dependent on trade England could disrupt. He worked to diversify Scottish trade routes, strengthen Scottish currency, develop Scottish resources. The mint Bruce established produced coins that proclaimed Scottish sovereignty, his image crowned, holding symbols of kingship, inscribed "Robert by grace of God, King of Scots." Every coin that circulated was tiny declaration of independence, reaching places armies never could. Bruce also reformed Scottish law to attract foreign merchants. He guaranteed safe conduct, fair justice, reasonable taxes. Foreign merchants who had avoided Scotland during the wars began returning, bringing not just trade, but recognition. Every Flemish merchant who accepted Scottish coin, every French ship that docked at Leith, was acknowledging Scotland's existence. The diplomatic web Bruce wove extended even to England's own dissidents. When English nobles rebelled against Edward II, Bruce offered them sanctuary, support, legitimacy. He couldn't militarily conquer England, but he could ensure England was never united against Scotland. The relationship with Ireland was Bruce's most ambitious diplomatic project, though ultimately unsuccessful. The attempt to create Celtic alliance against Anglo-Norman power was visionary, foreseeing possibilities that wouldn't be realized for centuries. Even in failure, it forced England to consider threats beyond Scotland, to spread resources thin. Throughout these diplomatic efforts, Bruce maintained remarkable consistency of message. Scotland sought only recognition of ancient independence, threatened no one who didn't threaten Scotland, would be faithful ally to any who acknowledged Scottish sovereignty. It was defensive position that made Scotland seem reasonable, England aggressive. Bruce also understood timing in diplomacy. When Edward II was strong, Bruce negotiated cautiously, buying time. When Edward weakened, Bruce pressed advantages. When Edward fell, Bruce moved swiftly to negotiate with new regime before it consolidated. Every English crisis was Scottish opportunity. The papal recognition that finally came in 1324, addressing Bruce as King of Scots, was triumph of patient diplomacy. It had taken 18 years from coronation, but Bruce had transformed from excommunicated usurper to recognized monarch. The spiritual weapon England had wielded against him was finally broken. By 1327, when negotiations for final treaty began, Bruce had created diplomatic reality that made Scottish independence inevitable. France recognized Scotland. The Pope recognized Scotland. The Hanseatic League traded with Scotland. Even elements within England accepted Scotland. The Treaty of 1328 merely formalized what Bruce's diplomacy had already achieved. The web of words Bruce and his chancellors wove proved more durable than military victories. Armies could be defeated, castles could be retaken, but ideas, once released into world, were harder to destroy. The idea of Scotland as independent nation, deserving respect and recognition, became fixed in European consciousness. As Bruce lay dying in 1329, he could reflect that his diplomatic legacy might outlast his military achievements. He had created not just independent Scotland, but idea of Scotland, narrative of Scotland, place for Scotland in community of nations. The spider's web of diplomacy, patiently constructed over decades, would hold Scotland secure long after Bruce himself was dust. The great hall of Cardross Castle echoed with the forced merriment of Christmas 1328. But Robert Bruce sat apart from the festivities, his once powerful frame wasted by disease, his face hidden beneath a hood to spare his court the sight of what kingship had cost him. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton had been signed. Scotland was free and recognized. His son David married to English princess. Everything he had fought for achieved. Yet the price of that crown grew heavier with each labored breath. Bruce's illness, probably leprosy, though medieval medicine lacked precise diagnosis, had begun years before. Perhaps contracted during those desperate months hiding in the Western Isles, perhaps divine punishment for Comyn's murder, as his enemies claimed, perhaps simply the cruel randomness of disease. Whatever its origin, it was slowly destroying the body that had split Henry de Bohun's skull, that had stood in the Schiltron at Bannockburn, that had endured everything England could inflict. "The crown is secure," Bruce told James Douglas, his most faithful companion, who had come to discuss the kingdom's future. "But crowns are bought with blood, Jamie, and the payment never ends. Each victory demands another. Each peace requires new war to maintain it." Douglas, the Black Douglas, whose very name terrified English children, looked at his dying king with grief he couldn't hide. They had been together since those desperate days after Methven, when Bruce had nothing but 40 men and impossible dreams. Now Bruce had everything: kingdom, recognition, legacy, except health and time. The price Bruce had paid went beyond physical suffering. His brothers, Edward, Thomas, Alexander, Nigel, all dead for Scottish independence. His first wife, Isabella of Mar, dead young. His daughter Marjorie, dead in childbirth. His sister Mary and Isabella Macduff, caged like animals for 4 years. Every person he loved had paid for his ambition, his vision, his determination to be king. Yet Bruce understood that personal price was only part of kingship's cost. He had done terrible things for Scotland's freedom, murdered Comyn in church, harrowed Buchan into wasteland, executed prisoners who might have been ransomed, destroyed Scottish castles that had stood for centuries. Each decision had been necessary, but necessity didn't make them less terrible. "I have been 3 men," Bruce reflected to Bishop Lamberton, who had come to offer spiritual comfort. The young earl who sought only his own advancement, the desperate king who would do anything to survive, and finally the victor who must live with what victory required. I wonder which God will judge. Lamberton, who had supported Bruce through excommunication and absolution, offered what comfort he could. But both men knew that some sins left stains that no absolution could wash clean. Bruce had built Scotland's freedom on foundation of blood and betrayal. The kingdom was pure, but the king was not. The transformation of Scotland during Bruce's 23-year reign was remarkable. From conquered province, it had become confident kingdom. The parliament Bruce called at Cambuskenneth in 1326 showed new Scotland, nobles, clergy, and burgesses meeting as equals, or at least more equal than ever before. Laws were codified, justice regularized, trade protected. Bruce had created new nobility based on merit rather than just birth. Men like James Douglas, Thomas Randolph, Walter Stewart had earned their positions through service, not inheritance. This meritocracy, radical for its time, created leadership class devoted to Scotland rather than their own narrow interests. The economic recovery Bruce orchestrated was equally impressive. The wars had devastated Scottish agriculture, depopulated entire regions, disrupted trade networks built over centuries. Bruce's policies, tax relief for devastated areas, protection for merchants, encouragement of immigration to depopulated regions, slowly rebuilt Scottish prosperity. But the price of this rebuilding was constant vigilance. England might have recognized Scottish independence, but recognition and acceptance were different things. Edward III, growing into formidable monarch, clearly regarded the treaty his regents had signed as temporary embarrassment to be rectified when opportunity arose. Bruce knew his death would bring that opportunity. His heir, David, was 5 years old, would need long regency. The nobles Bruce had united through success and fear would fragment without his strong hand. England would probe for weakness, find it, exploit it. The price of the crown would pass to the next generation. To prepare for this, Bruce spent his final years establishing structures that could survive him. He appointed Thomas Randolph as guardian for young David's minority, knowing Randolph had the strength and reputation to maintain order. He confirmed the succession through David, and if David died childless, through Robert Stewart, Marjorie's son. He tried to bind the nobles through oaths, knowing oaths were weak chains, but better than none. Bruce also worked to secure Scotland's spiritual independence. The Scottish Church had supported him despite excommunication, but it needed formal recognition of its independence from English ecclesiastical authority. Bruce negotiated with Pope John XXII, using Scottish support for papal causes as leverage, eventually securing bulls confirming Scottish Church's autonomy. The cultural legacy Bruce fostered was equally important. He encouraged Scottish historians to write Scotland's story, understanding that nations existed as much in imagination as reality. The chronicles commissioned during his reign, though often more propaganda than history, created narrative of Scottish exceptionalism that would endure centuries. Bruce's support for education, particularly legal education, aimed to create Scottish professional class that could administer kingdom without foreign assistance. The clerks, lawyers, and administrators trained during his reign would maintain Scottish government through coming crises. But perhaps Bruce's greatest legacy was psychological. He had shown Scots they could defeat England, could maintain independence, could stand among European nations as equals. This confidence, earned at terrible price, would sustain Scotland through centuries of challenge. As 1329 began, Bruce knew his time was ending. The disease had progressed to point where he could barely eat, rarely left his chamber, needed assistance for basic functions. The king who had led charges at Bannockburn now couldn't mount a horse. Yet his mind remained sharp, planning for Scotland's future even as his own ended. His last parliament, held at Edinburgh in March 1329, was his farewell to the nation he had created. Too ill to attend in person, he sent detailed instructions through Randolph. The legislation passed, confirming laws, establishing succession, binding nobles to young David, was Bruce's attempt to rule from beyond grave. The death preparations Bruce made were characteristically thorough. He divided his treasures carefully, enough to David to seem kingly, enough to nobles to buy loyalty, enough to church to ensure prayers for his soul. Every bequest was political calculation disguised as generosity. Bruce's last confession, taken by Bishop Lamberton in May 1329, supposedly lasted an entire day. What sins he confessed, what absolution he received, remained between him and God. But witnesses said he emerged peaceful, as if great weight had lifted. His final request was that his heart be removed after death and carried on crusade to Holy Sepulchre, fulfilling vow he had made, but never kept. James Douglas would undertake this mission, carrying Bruce's heart in silver casket, dying in battle against Moors in Spain, ensuring his king fought for Christendom even after death. On June 7th, 1329, Robert Bruce, King of Scots, drew his last breath at Cardross Castle. His final words, according to Chronicle, were, "Now let me depart in peace, since mine eyes have seen thy salvation." Whether he meant Scotland's salvation or his own remained ambiguous, perhaps intentionally. The body was embalmed and carried in great procession to Dunfermline Abbey, traditional resting place of Scottish kings. The funeral was magnificent. Nobles from across Europe attended. Even English representatives came to pay respects. The man they buried was no longer the desperate fugitive of 1306 or even the victor of 1314, but symbol of Scottish independence, founder of nation that would endure. Yet even in death, Bruce paid price for his crown. His heart, carried by Douglas, never reached Jerusalem. Douglas died at Battle of Tebas de Ardals, throwing casket containing Bruce's heart into battle before making final charge. "Lead on, brave heart," he supposedly cried, "as you always did in life." The heart was recovered and returned to Scotland, buried at Melrose Abbey, separated from body it had driven so relentlessly. The price Bruce paid for Scotland's crown was everything. Family, health, soul, perhaps. He had started as calculating nobleman, switching sides for advantage, and ended as dying king who had sacrificed all for vision of free Scotland. The transformation was complete.